Now, as we begin the next segment of the course, we have a solid understanding of the historical circumstances and conditions leading to U.S. presence in the Pacific region in Asia. And let's recall that since the late 1800s, since the late 19th century into the beginning of the 20th century, the U.S. sought to establish the Pacific as our particular sphere of influence, not other parts of the world, not Europe, not Africa, but the Pacific. And let's also remember what a sphere of influence refers to. A sphere of influence refers to those areas outside a given empire or a given country whereby that country wants to assert its influence or sometimes even outright domination, control. And indeed, this ambition was accomplished by the United States as we annexed these various overseas colonies like the Philippines, like Guam, like Samoa. Let's remember the terms we use to refer to these colonies overseas, quote unquote, unincorporated territories. And as we annexed them, they became part of the United States, right? Or the more accurate term is they belonged to the United States, and therefore we became an empire. Now, there's going to be another empire, however, that would seek to challenge this U.S. pursuit of, control and domination in the Pacific region, and that would be the Japanese Empire, Imperial Japan, which would rise as an empire by the late 19th century into the 20th century. So obviously, imperialism in the Pacific remains our focus here, though it becomes even more complicated. We're going to see how this leads to a clash of two imperial formations in the Pacific. Okay, and both are expansionists. The Japanese Empire seeks to establish control of Asia. They want to form their own colonies and include them as part of the Empire of Japan. But we too want to maintain our presence in the Pacific. And therefore, when you see it in this way, two imperial formations within this delimited region of the world, and one is expansionist, and the other one had been expansionist, and arguably is still expansionist, well, they're bound to collide, right, in a structural sense. So therefore, you have the outbreak of World War II in the Pacific, and this has its very beginnings in the 30s, 1930s, but certainly after Pearl Harbor, the attack on Pearl Harbor, you'll see full-scale war in the Pacific between Imperial Japan and the United States. And it'll also involve other empires like the British Empire and the French Empire, who also had presence in the Pacific region. But really, being an Asian American history class, will focus more on the United States colliding with Imperial Japan. Now, in this slide here, we're going to look at these various subtopics here. We're going to examine the causes of World War II. And this is important because we want to see how empire and imperialism figure prominently in the eventuation of conflict, not to mention how that's going to affect Asian American history. We'll also look at how the Japanese Empire ascended so precipitously, as I mentioned, by the later part of the 1800s, and then certainly into the 20th century. It would, of course, collapse with Japanese surrender at the end of World War II, with the dropping of the atomic bombs by 1945. And another angle we'll take in this examination, in this history, is the Pacific War as a race war, quote unquote. Now, there's no denying that World War II, even in Europe, was a race war. Let's remember, for example, the attempted extermination of Jews from Europe through genocide undertaken by the Nazi regime, right? That's one race against the other. The Aryan race, so to speak, against the Jewish race. So obviously race looms large there. But also in the Pacific context as well, we'll see how both sides racialized each other. Let's remember our discussion of race as a social construction. Here, when we have now during this period an objective enemy, so to speak, the Japanese Empire, right? In our sphere of influence, well, you're going to see how race plays an important part in the propaganda to galvanize support for the war and to galvanize the war effort itself. And then we'll move on to a very important chapter in Asian American history, which was Japanese American internment following Pearl Harbor. Some of you may have heard about this, how Japanese Americans, citizens and non-citizens, were all interned, imprisoned in concentration camps during World War II. And basically you see the complete abrogation, taking away of their constitutional rights. So this was actually something unprecedented and remains so in many senses. That is to say, you have the abridgment of constitutional rights based on race, right? You're taking away their constitutional rights of a whole entire racial group here. Okay, and then finally we'll look at how some Asian Americans actually played a crucial role in the outcome of the war. This is a military history that's probably less known among Americans, but we'll see how Asian Americans were involved in military conflict overseas, right? Engaged in military campaigns and everything, and they became highly decorated. But they still had to face the fact that they were Asian, they were quote unquote Oriental, and therefore they had to overcome that barrier. And this is especially true for the Japanese Americans fighting in the European theater against the Nazi regime. Well, here they are fighting in the name of freedom and against fascism, which we'll discuss soon. They're fighting in the name of freedom against fascism. And meanwhile, their parents, their siblings are locked up in prisons, in concentration camps, at home. So the contradiction is glaring. So this is almost like a moral dilemma they face. And how should the Japanese approach this, the young Japanese that were involved in the military? So these are questions that we'll examine later in this course. Now, of course, in this unit, we're discussing World War II and emphasis on world, that is to say global. So it's not just the Pacific, obviously. And in fact, historians like to refer to two so-called theaters during World War II. There's the European theater, and as you can well imagine, that involves, the Nazi regime, but also the English Empire. Many of the other European empires were defeated or even just dropped out right early, like the French, for example. They weren't really involved militarily. And then there's the Pacific theater, and of course that involves Imperial Japan, the Japanese Empire. And the main adversary is, of course, the United States. Now, there's also in the Pacific region at this time other European empires like the English Empire, the British Empire, the French. But again, I just acknowledge that France was basically knocked out, so to speak, early, and they decided not to even engage in that much fighting. So really, again, the rival here, the conflict, to be more accurate, is between the United States versus Imperial Japan in the Pacific theater. Now, it's important to discuss, at least briefly, the underlying causes of World War II, and even within the European context, within the European theater. And by the way, why discuss the European theater when, the focus of this class is the conflict between two imperial formations in the Pacific? Well, to begin, this discussion also involves imperialism, right? World War I is going to lead to World War II, as we'll discuss. This is really a conflict amongst empires. And of course, this is the theme of the class. And how those empires involve, moreover, race. Okay. Obviously, again, all themes of this course. Right. Another reason why we'll discuss World War II generally is because, as we will see, it will connect to the next unit of this course, Unit 3, and that's the Cold War. And with the Cold War, the Cold War erupts largely due to the outcome of World War II. All right, so if anything, we see a historical continuum. And if you look at the slide here, okay, the continuum refers to this. You have World War I, which was a devastating war, but it's going to lead to World War II. And then with the outcome of World War II, we're going to see how that flows into the Cold War. And all of these involve empire. So, therefore, this is the seamless connection here. And the reason why we have to expand our angle of vision, so to speak, beyond just the Pacific, at least for now. Okay, so let's take a look at this slide. And the question posed here is, after World War I, which was supposed to be the war to end all wars, so to speak, why does that lead to another world war right after the conclusion of World War I? So World War I, up to that point, was the most devastating war in human history. And the effects, the consequences, demographically, socially, culturally, politically, were so tremendous that they called it, again, the war to end all wars. And in fact, no one could imagine another war of the similar scope, at least, happening again. Yet, lo and behold, what happens? Just a couple of decades after the end of World War I, we see World War II break out. And what would happen is it's even more devastating, more tremendous than World War I. So the question emerges, why another world war after World War I, which was, again, supposed to be the war to end all wars? By the way, this question, or the answer to this question, is directly connected to another fascinating question, which is this: how did Hitler take this downtrodden and defeated Germany at the end of World War I, which is 1918, right? How did he take that country, a defeated country, to become another dominant empire by the 1930s? So it's interesting connection to, again, why does war erupt soon after World War I?